Somewhere in you right now, there is a scoreboard. You don't call it that, but it's there. Someone cut you off in traffic and you felt it. Someone took credit for your idea in a meeting and you remembered. A friend said one cruel thing years ago and you can still hear the exact tone of their voice. You think you've moved on. You haven't. Your brain has simply filed it away, waiting. You might tell yourself you're not a vengeful person. Most people don't feel like they are, but the feeling isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It sits quietly, keeping a tally you didn't agree to keep in a language older than any word you know. But the real answer actually goes deeper, because that quiet scoreboard inside you is not a flaw. It is not pettiness. It is one of the oldest survival tools your species ever built, and once in the hills of Appalachia, it turned two ordinary families into legend and buried a generation in the ground. You've probably heard the name. The Hatfields and the McCoys. It has become a joke, a shorthand for two stubborn people who won't let something go. But the real story is not a joke. It is a case study in how a single act of betrayal can hijack the human mind and refuse to release it for decades. It begins along a creek called Tug Fork, on the border between West Virginia and Kentucky, in the years after the American Civil War. On one side lived the Hatfields, led by a powerful bearded man named William Anderson Hatfield, known to everyone as Devil Ants. On the other side lived the McCoys, led by Randolph McCoy. They were neighbors. They traded. They intermarried. For a long time, they were simply two families sharing a hard and beautiful stretch of land. Then, in 1865, a McCoy relative named Asa Harmon McCoy was killed after returning home from the war. Suspicion fell on a group tied to the Hatfields. Nobody was ever punished. And here's the first thing to understand about betrayal. It is not the injury alone that scars you. It is the injustice. The sense that something was taken and no one made it right. Your brain treats an unpunished wrong differently than an accident. Neuroscientists studying revenge have found that when people are wronged and given a chance to retaliate, the dorsal striatum lights up. That's a region tied to reward and anticipation. Planning revenge, in other words, can feel good. The philosopher Robert Nozick once separated revenge from justice. But your ancient brain does not always draw that line. It just wants the scoreboard settled. For years, the tension simmered. Then came the pig. In 1878, Randolph McCoy accused a Hatfield of stealing one of his hogs. In that time and place, a hog was not a small thing. It was food, money, survival through winter. The dispute went to court, and the case turned on the testimony of a man named Bill Staton, who was related to both families. He sided with the Hatfields. The McCoys lost. A stolen pig. That's what history records as the spark. But the pig was never really the point. The pig was just the moment the old wound reopened. Bill Staton was later killed in a fight with two McCoys, and now the scoreboard had blood on it. Then something happened that neither family could control. In 1880, Rosanna McCoy, Randolph's daughter, fell in love with John Hatfield, Devil Ance's son. Two young people from the two houses, drawn together exactly the way you'd expect if you know anything about human beings. For a moment, love looked like it might do what courts and creeks could not. It might end the thing. It didn't. Johnsey abandoned Rosanna, who was pregnant, and later married her own cousin. The romance collapsed into humiliation, and humiliation is fuel. Then came the day everything broke. Election Day, August 1882. Ellison Hatfield, Devil Ance's brother, got into a brawl with three of Randolph McCoy's sons. Ellison was stabbed more than 20 times and shot. He was dying. The Hatfields seized the three McCoy brothers. And then they waited. They waited to see if Ellison would live. When he died, they tied those three young men to bushes near the riverbank and executed them. More than 50 bullets were fired. Now sit with that. Three sons killed not in the heat of the fight, but coldly, deliberately as payment, as a balancing of the scoreboard. This is the terrible logic of the blood feud, and it is ancient. Anthropologists who study feuding societies, like Christopher Boehm, who spent years documenting blood feuds among the tribes of Montenegro, found the same pattern again and again. A killing demands a killing. The debt is not personal. It belongs to the whole family and it does not expire. Why would the human mind build something so destructive? Here's the strange part. In a world with no police, no courts you can trust, no state to enforce anything, the threat of revenge is the only thing keeping you alive. If everyone knows that harming your family means certain retaliation, they think twice. The feud is a deterrent written in blood. Your ancestors did not feud because they were savages. They feuded because for most of human history, the alternative was being preyed upon with no consequences at all. Think about the world your ancestors actually lived in. No government reached the mountains. No sheriff was coming. If a stronger neighbor decided your cattle were now his cattle, there was no office you could walk into and file a complaint. The only wall between your family and ruin was a promise. The promise that anyone who touched you would pay in kind, forever, without exception. That promise had to be believed to work, and the only way to make it believed was to keep it, even when keeping it destroyed you. The problem is that a deterrent and a tragedy look identical from the inside. Once the killing starts, the same logic that was supposed to prevent violence now demands it. Each side is certain it is only responding. Each side is the victim. Each side is keeping score. And no one anywhere in the chain can find the exact place to stop, because stopping feels like surrender, and surrender feels like death. The feud exploded. Over the following years, homes were burned. Ambushes were laid along the mountain paths. On a freezing New Year's night in 1888, Hatfield men surrounded the McCoy cabin and set it on fire, trying to wipe out Randolph's family in one stroke. 2 more of his children died. His wife was beaten and left in the snow. Randolph survived, but he had now lost multiple children to the thing that started supposedly with a pig. The violence grew so large that it crossed state lines and reached the Supreme Court of the United States in an 1888 case over whether Kentucky could try men seized from West Virginia. 2 states, and eventually the highest court in the land, pulled into a quarrel between 2 families along a creek. By the time it burned out in the early 1890s, dozens were dead or imprisoned. And for what? Ask anyone on either side and they could tell you exactly who wronged them first. That was never the confusion. The confusion is that everyone was right, and it didn't matter. You carry the same machinery. You will never tie anyone to a bush by a river. But the wiring that drove those families is the wiring in your own head. The refusal to let an injustice stand. The way a small slight can reopen an old wound. The certainty that you are only responding, only balancing what someone else started. Economists have tested this directly. In a famous experiment called the ultimatum game, one person is given money and told to split it with a stranger. If the stranger thinks the offer is unfair, they can reject it, and then neither person gets anything. Purely logically, you should accept any amount, because something beats nothing. But people don't. Again and again, they throw away real money just to punish someone who insulted them with a stingy offer. Your brain will burn its own house down to keep the scoreboard even. It would rather have nothing than let unfairness win. That is the McCoy cabin on fire, scaled down to a laboratory. Same instinct, same refusal, same ancient debt demanding to be paid. The Hatfields and McCoys eventually did something remarkable. They stopped. Generations later, descendants of both families signed a truce. In 2003, they came together publicly to declare the feud over. Not because anyone forgot who was wronged, but because someone finally chose to stop keeping score. And that is the quiet, difficult truth hidden inside one of America's most famous feuds. Revenge feels like justice. It feels like closure. Your ancient brain promises that once the score is settled, the wound will finally close. But it almost never does. The scoreboard just keeps running, generation after generation, until someone decides the game itself is the enemy. So think again about that scoreboard inside you. The traffic, the stolen credit, the cruel words you can still hear. You think you haven't moved on. Maybe you're right. But you are the first person in that ancient line who gets to choose whether the score matters at all.